streaming? So it's a little dark, but anyway, we're just for this. Okay, so welcome back, and so can you just tell us, Greg, you know, like how you, you know, got access to tell this story, and what kind of work that you had to do to gain the trust of the subjects of this film, and how, and you know, how you like literally did it.
Mm-hmm.
And why?
Yeah.
And why?
Yeah.
In 2001, I began working for a syringe exchange program in Chicago, a program that distributes sterile syringes and all of the clean and new injection equipment necessary for drug injection to happen. And you're familiar with the concept here. You're much more advanced in your thinking in Canada than we have been in the US, but it's the only recognized, known, proven way to limit the spread of HIV and hepatitis C among people who inject drugs. And this is a street-based program through a mobile outreach van system. So they're like Grumman step vans, and folks would come on and go through the supplies and get what they need. And there's a brief kind of checklist and a check-in system through an anonymous code. And so I began to volunteer for them. Very soon after that, I began to meet unaddressed needs, because not everybody can make it out to a van site. The van operates 7 days a week in 7 different locations. So in your neighborhood, or the nearest one to you, is only going to be there for a 2-hour window on a Wednesday night. And maybe that's not going to be convenient for you. So I began in particular to do backpack syringe distribution. And I specialized in abandoned buildings, abandoned properties, and homeless encampments around the west side of Chicago. And at the time, there was a community of people, about 200 people, living in a plywood and cardboard shanty village that was kind of spread out along some abandoned freight train tracks that ran alongside a salvage brickyard. So they called the village the Brickyard. And I began to do outreach there, and then I began to spend more hours there, and I was trained as a phlebotomist. I was doing some fairly traditional biomedical research and also doing filmmaking at the time. So I was drawing blood for hepatitis C and hepatitis B tests, and also giving vaccinations for hepatitis A and B, doing all the things that harm reduction workers do, spending more and more time there. And I got a grant to study risk factors associated with injection technique. So doing a very fine-grained videographic analysis of how people actually inject drugs, and how different parts of the injection process are riskier than others from a bacterial or viral standpoint, right? So the job was to record 450 injections of 450 different people in their natural setting, and then systematically, very carefully look at every moment in that to see how much blood was being let, how much material might have been introduced to, contaminating material might have been introduced to the body through the injection wound. So you can imagine, it was a huge volume of material. And so about 100 or so people into it, the guy who they considered to be the godfather of the Brickyard, his name is Steve, he came up to me and he said, "Are you ever going to make a..." And I was making art films and other films on the side. I just wasn't really doing any like actual filmmaking in this context. And he came up and he said, "Are you ever going to make like an actual film, like a real film about this place?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, we've all been talking about it. It's just really kind of insulting that you don't include our faces." And I wasn't allowed to film their faces through Institutional Review Board, Human Subject Protection Regulations said I couldn't show any identifying features. Mostly I couldn't show their faces. So I had to film everybody from the neck down, or the chin down. So he said, I said, "That's a really interesting thought." And he said, "Yeah, a lot of us have been talking about it." And he said, "None of us really have any family photos anymore, and we're not really allowed to go back to our families. They don't want us in their houses. We don't have any of our home movies. So you're going to be our documentarian." And I was like, "Oh, cool." So that became my job. And so I started doing that in 2003, and I worked in that Brickyard Village for about 7 or 8 years, and I was there probably 4 days a week for that entire period, making many different kinds of films and doing harm reduction outreach. I lived there for extended periods, usually only 3 or 4 days at a time, because I was raising my son in that period of my life. And then around 2010, the U.S. got a bunch of anti-terrorism money starting in 2006 or 7, so they started doing things like cleaning up these shanty towns under the guise of like anti-terrorism. And that's what happened. So the police came in, they sprayed that liquid fire over everything and burned everybody's belongings out. So they burned all the shacks and all the clothing and all whatever limited personal effects people had, burned them all out. So the folks who were living there, who had really developed quite a thriving village, began to disperse, and many of them found their way into abandoned buildings. So abandoned apartment buildings, abandoned condominium buildings. And Steve and Pam in particular, very influential. He's the one who was the godfather of the village. Had always been known for creating really domestic spaces. And so, I mean, everybody did. Everybody, you know, even in the shanty, you know, the shanties, people hung pictures, and they had an aesthetic, they had a design, they had certain ideas about personal effects and the way they wanted their lives, their environments to look, and the way that they lived their lives, in a way that would make them most satisfied and most content. And so they were known for having, you know, sort of taken that whole thing to the next level. They were like the HGTV
Oh, yeah, right.
version. You know, we all know those people who are just amazing at like creating their living spaces. And Steve and Pam were on that far end of the continuum, but not extremely far from everybody else, because we all have those concerns about making home and making a place called home. And so I got really interested in that transition, and so I just ended up spending about 6 weeks as they moved into this place that they call the Abandonminium, and they were setting up house there. And I decided that I was going to shoot a film about domestic life. And so this is a film about domestic life. It just happens to be the case that the people who are featured in this are using heroin. So that's how I did it. I had a very small crew with a camera that arrived broken. The servo zoom was stuck. I don't zoom very much anyway, but when you want to zoom and you can't, it's just really frustrating. But so yeah, it was just like a 3-person. There's a sound operator, which we haven't really talked about sound tonight, but I was actually thinking about sound. I mean, I think about sound design a lot. I'm as obsessed with sound design as I am with visuals, and like the whole library thing. I was just imagining like a soundscape of different parts of the library, and actually having a phenomenology of sound in the way that we experience different parts of the library, which could be a cool way to do something about the library. But anyway, so sound's very important. I did have one sound operator, and I was running the camera. So that was it. And we shot the bulk of the material you see here in 3 days, even though I was there for about 6 weeks, off and on. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Okay.
So that's it.
Okay.